Welcome to Personality. I'm your host, Lori Rawlings from Lori Rawlings and Associates, and my guest today is Miriam Warren, who is the Chief Diversity Officer at Yelp. She's also the board chair of the Yelp Foundation, which counts nonprofits like La Cocina in San Francisco and Hot Bread Kitchen in New York among its grantees. Miriam joined Yelp in 2007, serving in a variety of marketing and operational roles, including leading the company's expansion efforts internationally as vice president of new markets. Presently, she heads a team working at the intersection of culture, engagement, social impact, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Miriam has been quoted in the New York Times, Fortune, Mic, and Good Morning America Online, among others. She's previously been published in the Stanford Social Innovation Review and Fast Company and is a frequent speaker and moderator. Miriam, welcome and thank you for being here.
Oh, Lori, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. It's great to have you. Can you tell us how you got your start at Yelp?
Absolutely. So, way back in 2005, I was writing reviews on this little known platform called Yelp. And then I became what we call a Yelp elite. So, these are the most active and prolific members on the site. Once I joined the Yelp elite squad, it sort of went to my head, frankly. I started telling people that if they played their cards right, they could be my plus one to these amazing parties. And I was also starting to think about, having grown up in Las Vegas and gone to college in the Bay Area, kind of wanting to explore a little bit more of the US, particularly on the East Coast, and thought that I would make a move there. And just so happened it coincided with a role of a community manager, the first community manager in Washington, D.C. And so packed up my things in San Francisco and moved to Washington, D.C. to become a community manager, which I found out was actually a thing I was probably doing for free and had been for many years for all of my friends. And now I got to do it as my job.
Wow, that's amazing. So what drew you to working on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging issues?
I think I've probably always had this desire. And by that, I mean, I grew up in a family where I am the only person of color, I'm the only mixed race person, and I'm also adopted. And so I think I've always desired a place for belonging for myself, and also always felt more at home in really diverse settings. And so that desire translated first into, things like entering the 7th grade talent show with a speech on the scourge of racism while other people were playing the flute, or doing some, Roger Rabbit or Running Man. And then in high school became something where I, was the founder of the Multicultural Student Union at my technology magnets high school. And then in college, it translated into, majoring in ethnic studies and eventually writing a thesis about, issues of mixed race at the intersection of race, class, gender, and sexual orientation. And from there, I really thought, well, if I'm not going to become a professor, which I certainly thought and considered pretty carefully, but that didn't work out for me, and now I'm kind of glad about that. I sort of thought that this would be something that I could really only talk to people about at dinner parties or over cocktails, like people that I already knew were really interested in the topics. And so it was a little bit of a surprise that I could make a career of this. And I can absolutely say that I think my 7-year-old self would be really delighted to know that I became a chief diversity officer. But my 20-year-old self, 25-year-old self, probably even 35-year-old self would never have guessed that this is where I would end up. And yet it really feels like I've been working towards this for a lifetime, because these issues really matter to me and I think are core to really how business runs now. I think that if you don't know about these issues, if you're not aware of them, if you don't care about them, it's pretty difficult to be a great leader in today's business market. It's pretty difficult to run a great company. It's pretty hard to be aware of what your employees care about and what they expect you to care about.
That is such an inspiring story, and you make such a great point that these are really business issues that business owners should be aware of and should care about. in order to serve their employees, but also their customers. So I think I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. Now, I've noticed that Yelp is incredibly transparent with regards to its DEI initiatives by publishing its plans and a wide variety of statistics online. Why has Yelp chosen to be so transparent?
I think if you particularly look at the last 2+ years or so, I think the pandemic has really accelerated kind of this evolution in something that I had already seen starting to happen, which is what the employee-employer social contract looks like. I think more than ever before, especially as we are having our jobs kind of in our homes, employees are really calling on companies to recognize and support them with more meaningful actions than just providing a paycheck, right? That means that employees, as well as the consumers of our platform, want to see how we're living our values in everything that we do. And so I think that's a big contributor to the transparency. You also look at things like our partnerships with organizations like Open to All and the 15% Pledge and Gold House. Those actually help folks on our platform to uncover businesses that align with our values. And now more than ever before, you see a lot of research that suggests that people really do spend their money along with a consideration of their own values. And so when you think about programming like for heritage and celebration months, such as Pride, Black History Month, Women's History Month, we really do have an opportunity to kind of bring greater sense of belonging for employees, but also to help consumers find businesses that are aligned with their own values and the communities that they wish to support as they spend their money.
One of the things that you focus on in some of the literature you've published online is the staggering cost to the U.S. economy of inequality. I mean, you lead off the 2021 diversity report for Yelp, noting that over the past 30 years, inequality has cost the U.S. economy an estimated $23 trillion. Can you tell us more about why you included that statistic and what some of the sources of those costs are?
I think one of the reasons why we include such a sort of macroeconomic view is because we think this is much more than just one single company writing a diversity report. That number actually comes from the Brookings Institution's Brookings Papers on Economic Activity, and these numbers actually come from the education, homeownership, income, and business investment gaps between Black and white Americans. There's a growing body of research focused on measuring the impact of inequality in the US, and we are certainly proponents of wanting to bring that to bear, right? I mean, when you look at some other reports, like one that was released in 2020 from Citi, is looking at that, Black workers have lost $113 billion in potential wages over the past 2 decades because they couldn't get a college degree. The housing market has lost $218 billion in sales because Black applicants couldn't get home loans. 2.7 trillion in wages not earned by Black workers, about 13 trillion in business revenue that never flowed into the economy because Black entrepreneurs couldn't access bank loans. So, everything from, if you're looking at that larger piece, which is the racial wealth gap that exists in America, and also you think about that it's not just the gap, but it is something that affects all of us, right? So sometimes people are like, oh, well, maybe, diversity issues, that's about somebody else, that's not about me, or racial wealth gap, not about me. It is about you, because it's about all of us. And when we're looking at income inequality, that is bad not only for the communities that affects most acutely, but it's just bad for our economy overall, because it means that there's less money in the economy for everyone.
That's a really good point. And I think that probably explains why Yelp has chosen to move away from the more reactive approach that's sort of traditional that most companies have in terms of dealing with diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is oftentimes sort of focuses on kind of protecting themselves from legal liability, to a more proactive approach, establishing a new normal with regard to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Can you tell us a little bit more about Yelp's approach?
Yeah, I think that these issues have in the past maybe been considered a nice to have, and today really are a must have. And you're seeing that as you see more companies publicly reporting their work environmentally, socially, and governance wise, or ESG as it's colloquially known. And I'd say for us, there's something to be said about outcomes that are the result of policies built on racism in this country. And there are a lot of those, right? And so if employers want to be proactive in promoting diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, they actually have to get ahead of the trends that would continue to disproportionately impact employees based on the communities that they belong to. So some examples would be, instead of reacting to an attrition issue with working moms, why not put policies in place that proactively support caregivers? Or instead of reactively trying to solve for a racial or gender leadership gap, why not partner with leaders on a sponsorship initiative to build a diverse leadership pipeline from the beginning? And those are just some examples of things that we are doing. And I think when you're proactive, it allows for a lot of long-term solution thinking rather than short-term solutions. So things that are essentially what you're talking about, very reactive. And we do truly have a desire to get to the root of the problem. And we have access to information that can inform a lot of these decisions. We can hear directly from employees and listen to them. And we can then bring their perspectives into the room as we make these decisions.
I know that over the last several years, Yelp has developed some really specific strategies to attract more diverse talent, including shifting your focus to schools and geographic areas with more diverse populations than, some of the areas where it was traditionally searching for talent, and also controlling for bias in the interview process. Can you tell us a little bit more about both of those initiatives?
Yeah, absolutely. So many studies demonstrate that a diverse workforce leads to better engagement, better performance, but more innovation, and that companies that champion diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging perform better overall. And so when your mission is tied to diversity, equity, and inclusion as ours is, you're actually producing positive outcomes in so many ways if you're intentional about these items. And so one of the things that we think about is really that we want Yelp's employee base to reflect the diversity that exists in the US, globally, and also that exists among our consumers and our customer base, right? Because if we are not as diverse as the consumers and customers that we serve, we miss out, right? We miss out on a whole bunch of different opportunities. And so a few of the ways that we are doing this work is we've become a completely remote company in the past 2 years. Really, we decided on that kind of in the early part of 2020 and have been living into that in the time since. And what that's really meant is that we have a lot more opportunities to recruit from places that we couldn't before. So pre-2020, Yelp was recruiting in the US just in 5 major markets. So Phoenix, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and DC. Now we have employees spread all across the nation, and we're also able to take advantage of the diversity that exists in lots of different places that we weren't able to otherwise. I think North Carolina, for example, is a big hotspot for that, because there's a lot of really great concentrated talent there that in the past maybe only could take advantage of working at a few banks that are based in that area. But now with remote work, Yelp and other companies who decide to move to this distributed model are able to take advantage of that. In terms of what it means for us to be able to think about the bias that exists in the interview process, I think it's first actually educating all of the people that are involved in the process what their own biases are, and then it's controlling the process such that it isn't up to just 1 or 2 people to decide who gets hired. And also to take as many objective criteria as you can in the hiring process, and ideally to do all of that before you ever meet anyone. And then something else that's been really helpful to us is implementing a diverse slate initiative. And so that really speaks to the fact that if you never meet any folks from underrepresented backgrounds, you're certainly never going to hire them. And so we strive for every position that a hiring manager is opening up, that they would get access to a diverse pool of qualified candidates. And it's already shown certainly some good early returns, and continuing to sort of spread that out, kind of piloted it initially in one area of the business and then spread it further out through the business. And also recognizing that you don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. That, like, I think when you introduce these types of initiatives, I think sometimes there is this desire to make them like work exactly the same in every single place and not take into account all of the differences and nuances of certain aspects of different parts of the business. And so I think we have been able to be pretty open to how that might look, while still trying to have that same idea in mind, which is that if every position is accompanied by a diverse pool of qualified candidates, we're going to have a really good chance that we're bringing in great folks and also a really diverse set of workers.
I think one of the things that is so interesting to me about the way Yelp has chosen to be so intentional about this process is that it hasn't stopped at just the top leadership level. It's also holding individual department heads accountable for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion within each department. Can you tell us a little bit more about why that's important?
I mean, we really feel like every organization should hold their leaders accountable. I mean, championing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging should be an expectation, should be, brass tacks for any leader. And so many industries measure a leader's success based on performance. Engagement and development are some of the things that drive performance, and diversity and equity are critical to make sure that everyone on your team can succeed. And for us, that's how we measure inclusion at Yelp. And so, department heads, they know their teams best. And when we're working with those teams to work towards goals that promote diversity and inclusion, we want to make sure that these leaders at every level of their teams want to be and are active partners in reaching these goals. So it's not that you sort of either have simply the team that's working on diversity with this goal, or you have this overarching goal, but no one knows who's doing it. Every leader at Yelp knows what they're doing in relation to this. In fact, something that really gave me such a good feeling and reminded us why this work is so important is that on a recent survey that we gave to employees, we got a score back that was 95% of employees answered favorably to this question, which is my manager, or to the statement rather, my manager creates and fosters an inclusive work environment. And I think that is where you start to see the rubber meet the road in terms of why individual department heads should be held accountable, is because they are the people in the best position not only to make hiring, firing, and sponsorship decisions, but they're also the people who can convey just how important this message is and get that to middle management and others. And I think that's just fundamentally how this work actually happens.
That's a really impressive statistic. I'm not sure that I can come up with many other companies where 95% of the respondents would say that diversity, equity, inclusion is a real part of their daily working environment. So that's amazing. And it kind of picks up on another point you made, which is, it's not only the leadership that is involved. It's really everybody who works within the organization who has a role to play in creating a sense of inclusion and belonging. And I think toward that end, Yelp has introduced mandatory company-wide training on systemic racism and institutional bias. Can you tell us a little bit more about that initiative and why it's important?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of debate on whether unconscious bias training is effective or should be mandatory. But if we're really going to choose to champion diversity, equity, inclusion in organization, which is we have, we need everyone to be building a knowledge base together, making no assumptions on what employees do or don't know, and moving forward on a learning journey together. I mean, if we have expectations of our employees on how and why they should contribute to inclusion at Yelp, we also need to provide the tools and shared language to help them succeed and take ownership as well. I mean, we want our workforce to take that knowledge and put it into action, but also have the space to reflect and become more equipped over time to really be allies in the workplace, to interrupt bias and to advocate for equity. And I think When you think about diversity training, I'd say most people, maybe minus myself and a few crazy others, like aren't really excited about diversity training. They're like, oh no, an hour of my life I'm never going to get back, or like 6 hours of my life I'm never going to get back. But the way I really look at this is, I think there's another way. In fact, I think that there is a way to meet your employees where they are and to give them really actionable and sound advice that helps them to not just sort of know what the right answer is, but to become fluent in the language. And I think, and what I mean by that is that if you have the type of training which we have, which runs a lot of scenarios, so it's like, this thing could happen, how would you react? Let us give you some examples of possible range of reactions and what we think you might want to do in the future. And the reason why we built it that way is because we heard so much from employees saying, please give us more examples. Please don't just read us definitions and give us a really boring lecture, but like, let us be involved in this. And when you meet employees in that way and you do and treat training in this way, I think then it becomes more of a partnership. And it also gets people to buy in a little bit more because it isn't some kind of like off the shelf thing that you've told everyone to do, but we actually create this training in-house and we look at it. In fact, I was just looking at it earlier today all the time for updates because as you can imagine, in the world of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, the terms are evolving so much, the attitudes are evolving so much, the research is evolving so much that you really do need to check in on this often. And so, our position on this is that, we can provide really great, tailored, bespoke training that makes people feel empowered about these issues, not, guilty or unengaged.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, some of the most effective diversity trainings I've seen incorporate exactly the elements you've described. They are customized to the workplace, to the company. They involve actual real life scenarios that give people a little more insight into what we're actually talking about. Like, what is harassment and discrimination and bias, and how does it actually show up in real life? And why is that problematic? And how can I deal with it? And what can I do as an individual employee to, take a step to change that culture? So I think it's really amazing that you do that. And I would imagine that it's really moving the needle in a way that taking an off the shelf training probably was not working in the past. I mean, have you seen the results bear fruit?
I think a big place where you can see this qualitatively is just in how people talk about these issues inside the company. And what I love about it is that they're eager and willing to take these conversations on. And I think what I saw in the beginning of my work in this area was that it was very scary for people. And I think that fear has dissipated over time because it's been replaced with knowledge.
I was also reading that one of the other ways that you support employees is actually through different Yelp employee resource groups for different members of underrepresented groups. Can you tell us a little bit more about those?
Yeah, absolutely. So our Yelp employee resource groups, or YERGs, because we love acronyms, they serve as a resource for employees with shared social identities, characteristics, or life experiences, and they help to foster employee engagement, professional development, and a sense of belonging. We have now more than 20 YERGs, and they comprise nearly half of Yelp's employee population in terms of people who are involved in them. This year we established 4 new employee resource groups. YAPI, which is Yelp Asian Pacific Islanders, Mental Health and Neurodiversity, Somos Yelp for our Latinx folks and their allies, and Yelp Ability. And we also hosted our first YERG Leader Summit. And so this summit was really bringing together all of the leaders of the Yelp employee resource groups to have learnings and collaborations and just hear from them, like what is going on the ground. Because what you can imagine with these groups is that they're great when times are good. So they're great at fostering belonging and engagement. And when times are tough, like an example of when that community feels targeted either by a law or by something that's happened just in the world in general, they become crucial, right? This becomes a safe haven for folks to be able to come together and get solace from their own community members, to be able to speak freely. And I think that is so important, and it's become so much more important in a time where you're not necessarily in the same physical space as other people. And so we've really pivoted the employee resource program to go from what it used to be, which is very much location specific. So you belong to the Yelp parents group in Phoenix, to now you belong to every Yelp parent that exists globally, and you can all talk together. And I think, frankly, the dynamic of remote and distributed work has been pretty much only positive for the development of our employee resource groups.
That's great to hear, because I know a lot of employers are kind of anxious about this new world of remote work, and whether employee engagement is going to be lost if they remain remote. And it sounds like that's not the case. It's actually improved engagement in some respects.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we did really early on was I encouraged my team to not just think about how we would take in real life events and turn them virtual, but to actually ask ourselves the question, what do people need now? And be open to the fact that we might leave some things behind that we used to do and create some new things, because that's what folks are asking for now, and that we would continue to iterate on that process. And that has been really wonderful for us. I mean, in the past, we hosted something called a Yelp anniversary party. So anyone who is celebrating their Yelp anniversary in that particular quarter, or rather their work anniversary, would come to a party in real life. Obviously, we couldn't throw any parties over the last couple of years. And so instead, we have started to send these Yelp anniversary gifts out to people. And it's allowed us an opportunity to partner with all these incredible diverse vendors, so women-owned businesses and Black-owned businesses and so on, to get some amazing products into the hands of our Yelpers. So hot sauce and popcorn and handmade soaps and all sorts of things like that both speak to the desire and need for supplier diversity, but also just delight our employees who work for a company whose mission is to connect people with great local businesses.
And speaking of which, Yelp's diversity efforts have not only been sort of internal facing, but also kind of facing out into the broader community. And I know that Yelp has been using its platform to raise awareness and promote economic opportunity for underrepresented communities, especially Black and Latinx-owned businesses. Can you tell us a little bit more about why Yelp is choosing to do that and how it's going about doing that?
Yeah, I think what we realized was, I think like many companies, the conversation around diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging was primarily an internally focused conversation until the last couple of years, which has made us really have to think about, like, wait a second, we have this platform that hundreds of millions of consumers are using every single day, and they're using Yelp to decide where to spend their money, and they want to spend their money in a way that is consistent with their values. And so what we saw, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, was a lot of folks saying, we want to patronize Black-owned businesses. And there was no good way for them to find it. So you saw a lot of circulation of Excel documents and Google documents, trying to help people know in their own communities where these businesses resided. And we already had a women-owned business attribute, and were able to create a Black-owned business attribute at that time, and then continue on with Latinx-owned, LGBTQ-owned, and so on. And I think the reason why this has been so well received by consumers is, like, maybe you're willing to decide where you're gonna get pizza off of a spreadsheet for like a little while, but that's not really a very sustainable option. And so now not only can you find all these great businesses, but we have a whole series of collections, and you can find them in every single place that you go, and you can hear their stories. And as a part of our connection to the 15% pledge, which is about making sure that, it's something actually that most retailers use to say, okay, 15% of our shelf space will be dedicated to Black-owned businesses. We're not a retailer and we don't have any shelf space, but we do have events, and we do have these care packages that I told you about, and we have all these other things. And so some of our commitments for the 15% pledge include, 15% of our community events hosted at Yelp will feature Black-owned businesses. 15% of the vendors that our team works with for internal events will be from Black-owned businesses. 15% of our Instagram feed content will include Black-owned businesses, and 15% of our lists that focus on businesses will also be Black-owned businesses. So there's a lot of creative ways that that companies can think about how to support communities beyond simply your employee community.
That's amazing. And it's amazing the way that Yelp is leveraging its platform and technology to make a measurable difference, both internally and externally, with regard to these issues. And that makes sense because Yelp is a technology company that's very data-driven, and it's obviously taken a very data-driven approach to its diversity, inclusion, and belonging efforts. Do the data show so far that these new, more proactive initiatives are working?
I think the early returns do, and I think there are also a number of different macro environmental issues at play as well. I mean, we are now in the midst of, whether you call that the great the great resignation, or what I prefer, which is the great reshuffle, because I think most people that I'm seeing resign are not resigning to retire, but merely resigning to choose a different path for themselves, likely in a different organization. And so, there's this saying that we're all well acquainted with, which is like, what gets measured gets managed. And I think a data-driven approach, both quantitative and qualitative, is key to both defining the goals and also measuring progress. Data also helps to paint a fuller picture on sort of what is working well and where there are opportunities to sort of improve outcomes. And I told you a little bit about the survey that we put out to employees, which is one of the things that helped us to see some of the data on, like, is remote work working for people, and a host of other questions. We also use a number of dashboards that track demographic data that help us to understand how our recruiting efforts are working. We have a residential heat map that helps us to see which regional areas we can better tap into. And we also believe that disaggregated data helps us to stop treating communities as a monolith and see specific challenges that will help us to better design solutions. So, our report that you referenced earlier in the conversation sort of points to standard questions that provide an opportunity to sort of self-identify your race and ethnicity that lump every multi-racial employee into one group, but their experiences differ in many ways. And so one of the opportunities that we know is ahead of us is to start to disaggregate that data, right? And then there's also this question about intersectional data, which definitely paints a fuller picture, and is particularly as you think about women. We talk often a lot about women who are themselves not a monolith, but once you start to look at this intersectional piece, which is like, what about women of color? What about queer women of color? What about, women who are mothers? There's so many different experiences that are happening. And I think not only looking at the data, but double clicking into that data and starting to disaggregate that data gives us a much fuller picture of what we're working with, and also tells us where it is working and where it isn't.
That's a really good point. I mean, we're not talking about monolithic groups in any respect at all. It's really important to recognize the individuality and the humanity of everybody who comes to work. And I think really drilling down in that data to get an understanding of the experiences people have every day makes a lot of sense, because my experience as a white woman is probably not the same experience that you've had as a woman of color. And I think it's really important to recognize that not all women have the same experience, just the same as not all people of color have the same experience. So this has been a really fascinating conversation, Miriam. I really want to thank you for being here. I'm just wondering if you have any closing thoughts or things we didn't cover that you think our listeners should know about.
Wow. Well, we're talking about many of my favorite subjects, and I've so appreciated your questions, Lori. I think there are many things we could keep discussing, but one thing that I think is important for folks to know is that I think the companies that will benefit the most from making diversity, equity, inclusion a core part of their businesses are ones that are intentional about this, right? It's like that intentionality is really, really important. It's, I think, even more important than, the question of budget and who should be doing it and all of those things, which are very important. But I think that intentional placement of saying this is core to who we are, and this is a lens through which we will look at all of the work that we do is super important. I think it's also important to mention that, language continues to evolve, and there's no excuse for us to not keep on putting the work into learning what that evolution looks like. And so the word allyship, for example, is a word that's thrown about a lot. And what I would love to leave your listeners with is sort of this idea about how we all kind of feel like we might mess up, especially in these very important topics. And so what I want folks to know is that, the idea of messing up should not validate your inaction. It should really push you to say, like, you can and will mess up, and that is okay. Everyone can be an ally. Most of us hold some form of privilege. And we can use that privilege on behalf of others. And so when you think about, like, what could I do today, even if I don't run a company or don't manage people or don't consider myself a leader, everyone can be an ally, and everyone can take responsibility for their own education on these topics. And everyone can use their own privilege on behalf of others in big and small ways every single day.
Those are really inspiring words on which to wrap up today, Miriam. And I really want to thank you for the work you're doing and for the time you've spent with us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Lori. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure as well. And for our audience, there will be links to Yelp's annual diversity reports for 2020 and 21 in the show notes, so you can learn more about the initiatives Yelp is undertaking and some of the data that they're mining.